much into Brent's um, lecture time. So, okay, so let's get started. So, welcome to the International Forum on Youth 2020. Yeah, it is still 2020, I think, unfortunately. My name is Professor Matsumoto. I am a professor in the Department of Mathematics here at College of the Canyons and a faculty co-coordinator of this week-long event, together with Dr. Brent Riffel, who will be our first speaker, from whom you will be hearing fairly soon. It is so great to have you here. It is a great honor to host an event like this. You know, you would think that maybe a major four-year university holding a conference of global issues like this, but you know, it's not usual to see a community college holding a meeting like this. So I'm very privileged to be working at a community college that holds such a great opportunity as this forum, focusing on the needs of students and current events involving globalization, international issues, and challenges faced by youths all around the globe. This is the second year in which we are hosting this, and last year we had great success with the theme identity. This year's theme is migration and its consequences and implications and so on. And we are talking not just migration of people or a people or peoples, but also of species and ideas and perspectives. Next year, our theme will be transition. And so this event is sponsored by the ISP, or International Services and Programs Office. And here we have the director of that office, the Dean of International Affairs and Global Engagement, Dr. Cheng Levine.
Thank you, Sab. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And we are just so excited. Because last year, we had a wonderful turnout as well. And then this year, we actually got a grant from CCIE, Community College for International Education, to be able to allow us to host this event virtually. And we also have been promoting it extensively on Facebook and all social media platforms. And like Sab said, that I just feel very privileged to be able to work with a group of just talented, passionate, ethical faculty, staff, and administrators on campus to be able to put this together. And I just want to say a few thanks to special people. One is Tim Honadale, who is the director of ISP, who has been just really helping the ISP office in terms of logistics support. Without his enthusiasm and his support, it was difficult to get an event like this going. And then, of course, we have Marisa Mozon, and who is passionate about international education. What she has done is quite incredible. Starting last year, that's our theme, identity, and this year, like what Sab said, is migration, and that's next year is transition. She has been providing just incredible amount of logistics support for our faculty, and especially for our speaker across the globe. Today alone, we will have Brent today, and then this afternoon Tim, and then this evening Dr. Regan Ramani, and then tomorrow night we have speakers, for example, from Australia, and tomorrow morning speaker from New York. We just have a lot of exciting events going on, and the purpose of this, of course, is to foster a kind of scholarly inquiry and curiosity among our students, among our faculty, to create a platform for dialogue for topics and issues that we believe today's youth today's youth face and feel perhaps challenged. And most important is maybe they want to find solutions to it. And I think that is important that we have a STEM panel tomorrow afternoon, and then we also have a scholarly panel on Thursday. So all this you can find the details from our website. And of course, the people that I feel the most fortunate to be able to work with is with our faculty, Dr. Brent Riffel and Dr. Matsumoto. They be at every planning meeting. We've been planning for this thing for 9 months. And since I think August, we're this going. And I'm proud to say that I believe it's a great. Join us, please, in the process, and then make sure if you have any questions when the speaker is speaking, now go ahead and type in the chat box, and we will monitor the chat box. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our opening speaker, Dr. Brent Riffel. Now, Dr. Riffel has been at COC since 2008, and he was the co-coordinator for, I have to get this right, Center for Excellence in Teaching and like what Sab said. People would think a center like this is very common at university, but for community college to have a center like this is as the co-coordinator for a long time, right? For at least 10 years, if not longer. How long were you at 3 years, 4 years?
5 years.
Please, did my internet just freeze? Can you guys still hear?
I can hear you, but you did freeze a little bit.
But I'm going to take that as my cue. I'm going to take that as my cue. Thank you, Dr. J.
Meanwhile, he also professor of history. That's it. That's all you want to do. I have to say you're professor of history, and then I just.
As Sab said, 2020 could not end soon enough. And one of the reasons is because of bandwidth and Zoom issues. So I'm going to jump in and start. I'm really glad to see all of you here. I see some familiar faces. I see some new faces. As Dr. J said, if you have questions, I certainly want to hear them. And I'd love to get a good discussion going here at the end. So please put your questions in the chat, and Sab, I think, is going to moderate that chat, and he'll let us know when questions arrive. But I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to get started here. And I'll kind of walk us through what we're going to talk about today. And then again, we'll save some time at the end for questions. We also have a poll at the end because we want to get some input on how we're doing and what your thoughts are on some other issues related to this. So let's get started here. All right, again, thanks for being here. This is a one-way ticket, African Americans during the Great Migrations. And I purposely wanted to have a topic that related to the theme for this year's forum, that's migration. And I also wanted that to dovetail with the African American experience. And I think if you've been alive on planet Earth in 2020, there have been enormous conflicts and struggles within the African American community over police brutality, over voter suppression, over all kinds of issues, over economic and social justice. And so I thought this would be a good topic that is timely to the world we live in now, and also, again, relates to the forum on youth. It's also a topic, the Great Migrations, that I think is one of the least known and least understood moments in American history. It's a topic that doesn't often appear in American history textbooks. It's a topic that profoundly changed the country and yet is little understood and little discussed. And that's what I want to get into today, is what was the Great Migration, what were its impacts, and what can it teach us about the world we live in today. So again, thanks for being here. Really glad you're here. As questions pop up, if comments pop up, please put them in the chat and we will absolutely address them. So my title comes from Langston Hughes, a great writer, poet from the Harlem Renaissance. We'll get into that in just a minute. One-Way Ticket describes his experience of basically making a new life for himself. And that's really what the Great Migration was. The Great Migration was the largest internal movement of Americans in US history. And it was an internal movement almost entirely of African Americans. And it was a movement of African Americans leaving the South primarily and finding new lives for themselves, first in the Northeast and Chicago in the Midwest, and later in the West Coast. And so imagine a whole segment of the country leaving. And this begins around the World War I era, 1914, 15, 16, and it continues throughout most of the 20th century. And again, it's the largest internal migration. In other words, it's the largest movement of one group of people from one part of the country to another part of the country. That's very unusual. It's enormously challenging to pick up your life and move to another strange part of the country. And we have to, as historians and as people interested in history, we have to figure out why that happened. So what we'll do today is talk about what was the Great Migration, what were its origins, why did it begin to happen? And then we're going to get into these ideas that historians call the push and the pull. In other words, what was pushing people to pack up, to give up their lives back in the South and make a new life for themselves elsewhere in strange cities that they'd never been to? What was pushing them? And then what was pulling them? In other words, what was pushing them out of the South and what was pulling them into urban centers in the West Coast and Northeast and Midwest? And then we'll talk about some of the concerns, the problems once people started to arrive. And so again, we're talking about millions of people packing up, making a new life for themselves. This is going to change culture. It's going to change art. It's going to change politics. It's going to change demographics. It's going to absolutely change the economic situation in this country. We'll get into this, but I can't stress enough how important this was. And it's fascinating to me how little reported it really has been over the years. So you may not know about the Great Migration, or maybe you do, but you know about it in ways that are maybe subtle, but important. And by that, I mean to say that there are famous Americans who were part of the Great Migration, right? The great Olympic track star Jesse Owens, of course, Jackie Robinson, LA star, and later Brooklyn Dodgers star, and then of course Tupac Shakur, right? I haven't listened to Tupac Shakur today, but I know many of you probably have. But these are people who I think are good examples of the Great Migration. They are people who either they or their ancestors left the South and made a new life for themselves in the West Coast or the Northeast, okay? And they are changed by that experience, and they change the places where they live, right? And so there are lots of famous people that were involved, but really what the Great Migration is about is not so much famous athletes, right? It's really about ordinary people, millions of ordinary people. And when we look at where this is taking place, again, this is a massive exodus out of the South. It's been called the African-American diaspora. It takes shape in two waves. The first wave goes from about 1915 to about 1940, roughly, and it is an exodus from the South into the Northeast and Midwest. And then the second wave is all over the country, but also extends out to the West Coast. And we're really talking about, again, millions of people. And in some parts of the remote South, it basically depopulates some of the rural areas. Certainly, if you look at the Mississippi Delta region, for instance, you'll see some counties in those regions are almost completely depopulated. So it's a lot of people, and you can see that it sort of peaks there in the 1940s, and we'll figure out why that was in just a moment. And by the end of the 20th century and moving into the 21st century, you see that the population of African Americans has completely changed. Whereas for most of American history, 90% of African Americans, because of the tradition of slavery, 90% were living in the South. Today, that's just over half. So this really changes who lives in the South and who lives in the West Coast and who lives in the big cities in the North. So let's get into why this happened, the roots of this. And to start, I want to look at the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, a sociologist, a historian. And in his book on Reconstruction, the years just after the Civil War, he gives us a really interesting quotation. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back towards slavery. And that's essentially what has happened to African Americans since the Civil War ended in 1865. Something really remarkable is going to happen. Slavery is going to end, and there's going to be opportunities, there's going to be advancements, there's going to be economic and social achievements, and then that window of opportunity is going to slam shut, and African Americans are going to find themselves moving back towards something that isn't quite slavery, but to many resembles it. Okay, so the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back towards slavery. We'll get into that in greater detail as we move along. So if you go back, I mean, we're talking about a 20th century phenomenon, but you know, historians, we have to go back. We could go back even further, but if we look at the end of the Civil War in the 1860s, we see a conquered region of the South. We see a region in ruins. We see major cities like Atlanta destroyed, right? And we see African Americans in real jeopardy in some ways, but also facing real opportunities. The amendments that were passed to the United States Constitution just after the Civil War, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendments, these ended slavery. They gave former slaves citizenship. They gave African-American men the right to vote, right? So the slave went free and stood a brief moment in the sun. We're approaching that moment in the sun of real opportunity. We're also seeing for the first time real opportunities for education. If you study the history of slavery, you might know that many slaves were forbidden to read, to learn to read, because reading can be such a dangerous act. It can be such a radical act, right? But now in that moment in the sun, we're seeing schools set up. We're seeing, again, opportunities for African Americans. We're also seeing real developments politically. This is Hiram Revels. He is one of many African Americans who, now that they can vote, are not just voting, they are getting elected. He was elected to the United States Senate. There were African Americans elected to local city council positions, sheriffs, you name it. In many southern states, South Carolina, for example, the majority of the population was Black. And so they are changing the politics. They are absolutely enjoying that moment in the sun to some degree, okay? But remember, it's just a moment. What happens in the 1870s as we move out of the Reconstruction era and out of the post-Civil War era is a very effective attempt by white Southern elites to strip African Americans of their political and economic rights. And one example of that is something we call black codes. The white South begins to impose poll taxes, forcing you to have to pay to vote. And these will last over a century, well into the 20th century. They also start to impose literacy tests that are only really applied to African Americans, right? And these are essentially designed to humiliate. They're designed to discourage you from even attempting to register to vote. And they work really, really well, okay? Again, for the next century, African Americans are going to be consistently denied the vote in this country, okay? Primarily in the South, but in other places too, okay? And so these black codes, these are examples of ways in which African Americans were denied the right to vote. These are very pernicious, they're very effective, and they last a while. You can see, I mean, they're abstract in some ways, right? These are literacy tests from the 1950s. And so again, they last quite a while, and they're designed for you to fail them, okay? What's also happening, by the way, is in order to further this attempt to stop Blacks from voting is real terrorism, real violence against African Americans. So the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back towards slavery. We're leaving that moment in the sun because of things like black codes. Black codes are designed, these are white Southern customs and laws designed to stop African Americans from voting. What's also happening is that moment in the sun is ending economically, because African Americans, while they may not be slaves anymore, they have no assets. They have no land, which is wealth. They have no intergenerational wealth that they can pass on to their kids. They often lack literacy. They often lack the skills beyond what they had done as slaves. And so up to 80% in some parts of the South of African Americans, up to 80% of African Americans end up sharecropping. Now, sharecropping is really complicated and it's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but this is essentially where you rent land from usually a wealthy white landowner. And it's a system designed to put you into debt. It's designed to keep you stuck to the land. And it too lasts for over a century in this country, where African Americans find themselves, yes, free, yes, no longer slaves, but actually in some ways, I don't want to say worse, but in some ways, it resembles slavery to them. Many African Americans are now working the very same land that they might have worked as slaves or that their parents might have worked as slaves, but now they're in debt and they have no real ability to accrue any wealth that they can pass on, any assets that they can build from, right? And so the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back towards slavery. We're moving very rapidly back towards slavery. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because I'm trying to set up a notion here that African Americans are going to be increasingly denied opportunities in the South, and it's going to force them to leave. And so again, you see African Americans, this is in Alabama, these are sharecroppers that are working literally the same land that they might have worked as slaves. What's also happening to further this intimidation, this denial of basic rights is the Jim Crow era, right? And this is both by law and by custom an effort to segregate and divide people by race, primarily in the South, but all over the country in some cases. And so what you're starting to see is political rights are being denied, economic rights are being denied. And then in the 1890s, the Supreme Court basically cements this with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which you may have heard of, and it grants separate but equal status. It basically makes it legal to deny African Americans equal education. It segregates public facilities, and this too will last well into the 20th century, right? So these are topics that if we were in a different lecture, if we were in a different classroom setting, we would have to kind of dive into all of these on their own because they're very complex. But what I want to again do here is paint a picture of an increasing level of frustration and hopelessness that African Americans experienced at the end of the 1800s, where yes, they are free, but they have been systematically denied some of the basic rights that other Americans enjoy. And now that the courts have stepped in and basically given their stamp of approval on this segregation, this Jim Crow separation, this is going to convince a lot of African Americans that there's no future for them in the South. And again, this segregation continues for decades. In schools, in hospitals, in cemeteries, in sports, you name it. We see this separate world taking place. And we also see, as I referenced just a moment ago, we also see increasing levels of violence. So this again is all part of the push. What's pushing African Americans to leave in the millions? The denial of political rights, the denial of economic rights, the denial of access to public facilities. And underneath all of that is an era of enormous violence and terrorism, right? The first real American terrorist organization, the Ku Klux Klan, emerges just at the end of the Civil War. And it is designed primarily to stop Blacks from voting, and it's pretty effective, right? And of course, the Klan is still with us today, regrettably, but it really takes off in the 1800s, again, as an effort to enforce these Black codes and enforce these denial of basic rights. And you see not just the Klan, but you see other organizations popping up across the South. Okay, so all of these things are pushing African Americans to a point of a breaking point where they realize there's no future for us here in the South. You also start to see widespread lynching. Now, we'll never really know the true death toll here, but we know thousands were lynched. And we know that the murder of African Americans was public, was often celebrated. You see kids in this photo here. What often happens is you would literally have kids taken out of school and their parents would take them to these public lynchings as if this is a lesson they should learn, right? And so you start to see this wave of violence. And these were, I will not argue that they were endorsed by the majority of the white South, but they were common enough that people committed these acts of violence, these acts of murder, with little fear of reprisal. In fact, they were common enough that you see here, this is from Kansas, this is a postcard. Lynchings were sold as souvenirs in corner stores. And this goes on even today, of course, but it goes on in a wave of lynchings from the end of the Civil War in the 1860s through the middle of the 20th century. Here's another postcard. And so this violence really takes root, and it's violence, it's unpunished. And this is, again, another example of what's pushing African Americans to reconsider their future in the South. This is an office in New York, the NAACP headquarters, where they would hang this flag every day someone was lynched, and they would try to chronicle this. But a lot of these lynchings, these murders were unreported. And we're still trying to get a sense of how prevalent they were. We have evidence of thousands, but I don't think, again, we'll ever know the true death toll here. What's also happening to push African Americans out is pop culture. The birth of the cinema, the birth of motion pictures. If you study the history of cinema, you will encounter D.W. Griffith. He's sort of a legend in terms of his technical innovations, but he's also a legend for this film, The Birth of a Nation, which was a very popular silent film that came out in, I think, 1915, that celebrates the Klan, that basically argues that the wrong side won in the Civil War, and that the Klan are heroic as they terrorize African Americans. And this was incredibly popular across the country. Okay, so you're seeing from the political arena, from the economic perspective, from other areas of life, you're seeing all these reasons accumulate as to why African Americans are feeling increasingly unsettled and frankly fearful for living in the South. I want to give credit to one a set of authors, Tolley and Beck, who wrote A Festival of Violence, and they've done a lot of great work in trying to figure out the degree to which this happened. And they concede in their book, which I think is excellent, that again, we'll never know the true death toll here, but their title, I think, is very suggestive. This violence was, in a sense, a festival. People celebrated this stuff. People laughed. They crowd around to get into the camera, to get into the frame. They drank. They made music. This was not, these lynchings, these episodes of violence, this was not a dark, dirty secret. This was something that was celebrated in some quarters of the American South. And so all of this accumulates. And so you start to see, really beginning in the 20th century, a real exodus, a real movement out of the South, beginning, interestingly, in Alabama, which had been one of the most heavily segregated parts of the South. And it starts to take off in waves. One of the things that starts to happen is that white business owners and landowners, they start to notice this, and they're concerned about this. They don't want to see the African-American community leave because this is a source of cheap labor. And so they literally begin to board trains and rip up the train tickets. They begin to forcibly stop people from boarding trains to get out. And it becomes a huge sort of fight to keep African Americans in the region. And this continues for quite some time until by the 1920s, the numbers are so large that it's just not something that the white community can stop. But they're aware that this is going on, and they're concerned about it. What's also happening to push African Americans out is some environmental effects. There's the pernicious little critter called the boll weevil, which starts to devastate cotton crops, and cotton had been the key agricultural product. And so as that begins to hurt profits, this begins to make it less tenable to stay in the South for African Americans, because those that even want to stay find the jobs are becoming more scarce. And so you have some environmental things going on here as well. You also have some other factors that are pushing African Americans out. Technology, mechanization is pushing African Americans out as well. Machinery that can do the work of many people starts to take root in the South. Once the Great Migration really explodes, mechanization and technology has to step up to deal with that. And so as African Americans leave, you see more technology taking root, which makes it very difficult to return to the South if you wanted to. So let's talk about the first migration. This really took root in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, and it's no accident that it happens during World War I. During World War I, the labor supply in this country, the United States, was basically cut off by the war. Immigrants had been flooding to the US from Europe, but the First World War made that very difficult for them, because those folks were no longer immigrating because they were in the trenches. They were fighting in World War I. And so what's happening is the United States, as it gears up to fight World War I, it has an enormous labor shortage up north, because there are all these factories that are going to be producing the things, weapons and other things that help us fight the war. And so there is kind of a series of interlocking sort of variables here, where we have this push that's forcing African Americans to leave the South. And now we're starting to get into the pull, because there are jobs up north. And we see factory owners sending down recruiters down south, who, by the way, have to operate in secret often to try to lure African Americans up to the north to work. Okay, often it would start with maybe young single men who would go up get a job in a factory, and then accumulate a little bit of money and send for the rest of the family. Sometimes it would be whole families. By the way, this is a painting by Jacob Lawrence, who experienced the Great Migration himself, and his series of paintings called the Migration Series is really great example of some of the art that came out of the Great Migration. What we're about to see is this explosion of art and culture and literature that comes out of this as well. So that's the pull, the jobs that are being developed, the jobs that are suddenly available in these northern factories, primarily in the Northeast, but also Chicago and other Midwestern cities, Detroit, for instance. And by the end of the World War I in 1918, and as we move into the 1920s, this Great Migration has exploded into the millions, right? And people are, again, making a new life for themselves in the North. At first, the first wave, it's very difficult to get a foothold, but as more and more families take root in the North, that creates an environment where we can send back for more people. You could go into a major train terminal in, say, Memphis, Tennessee, or Atlanta in 1920, let's say, and you could see images like this, where almost the entire terminal is full of African Americans, and they're all headed north. What's also pulling African Americans is the war. The First World War creates job opportunities. It also creates cultural opportunities, because as African Americans serve in the First World War over in Europe, primarily in France, they start to experience a world beyond the South. They start to experience an environment where racism isn't as ever present as it was in the South. And they come back from that experience changed. And we have lots of examples of that. And many of these Southern African-American World War I vets do not return to the South. They return to northern cities. These are World War I era factory workers. Another major aspect of the Great Migration, and it's part of the pull too, is the Harlem Renaissance. This is the cultural growth and spread of culture, African-American culture, beginning in the 1920s, just after World War I. And you see, this is a rally held in Harlem. It gets its name from that part of northern Manhattan known as Harlem, where if you walk down the streets of Lenox Avenue, you would see African-American businesses, African-American police officers, African-American nightclubs. And it was pretty inspirational to people coming from the South. And you see that sign there, the new Negro has no fear. That was a phrase that popped up in the 1920s, the new Negro. This was a person who often was part of the Great Migration, who felt that they were not going to abide by the rules of Jim Crow. They were not going to stand up and they were going to stand up and resist some of the segregation and racism that was so prevalent, right? And so Harlem was a place where African Americans begin to feel that they have some breathing room, and they begin to have an opportunity to get jobs, an opportunity to create wealth, to own an apartment, to have a future, right? And so you start to see a blossoming of culture and literature out of that experience, okay? And you can see lots of examples of this. Here again, if you study college, English courses often have, a whole section on the Harlem Renaissance where you look at the poetry of Langston Hughes, let's say, or Claude McKay, or the work of Zora Neale Hurston. And it's famous for its literature, but what it really, I think, also was ordinary people living freely as they could in these northern cities. And it's not just Harlem either. It's central Los Angeles. It's the south side of Chicago. It's Roxbury, Boston. It's all over the country, right? It gets its name from Harlem, but it's really this cultural blossoming that is a result of the Great Migration. It's also giving economic opportunities, the Great Migration. And this causes tension sometimes, but we have this development of something called the talented tenth, where you have this educated elite part of the Great Migration. And there's often tension between them and the rest of the Black community, right? And you start to see real diversity of opinion within the Black community, okay? And you start to see the growth of African-American colleges and education, right? So we're seeing with the Great Migration enormous change, enormous growth, but also challenges of living in a new environment and challenges of competing for jobs and that sort of thing. And so the talented tenth is this sort of intellectual and educated elite that's often, by the way, resented by the rest of the Black community for being condescending, for telling the rest of the community how to live and how to create their lives. And again, you also see educational opportunities, economic opportunities. This is more from Jacob Lawrence, whose work I love. We see new leadership, right? You see people like Marcus Garvey, who launches this Back to Africa movement, which is often misunderstood. He was part of the Harlem Renaissance, but now you're starting to see Black nationalism. And the Back to Africa movement, I think, is often misunderstood. It's not necessarily calling for African Americans to move to Africa. Most did not do that. But what it is asking African Americans to do is try to investigate their own roots, try to investigate their own African culture and tradition. So now with the Great Migration, we're not just moving, we're actually exploring our own history and traditions and culture. Okay, so many of you may know about Malcolm X. Malcolm X is sort of part of his family is part of the later Great Migration. And Malcolm X was born with the last name Little, but he takes the name X, right? And one of the reasons he takes that name X is because if you're African American, your surname, your last name often comes from a slave owner who once owned you or purchased you. And so African Americans didn't really know their roots. They didn't even really know their name, right? Because slavery had denied them that, right? When you were a slave, you only had a first name, if that. And so what Marcus Garvey and others are saying is, let's not just set up a life for ourselves up here. Let's explore who we are as a people and explore our traditions and our history. And this is profoundly important in the African American community. And this exploration of African traditions, again, doesn't mean you're moving to Africa, but it does mean that you're investigating who you are as a person and who your ancestors are. Now, I think a lot of the Great Migration is really positive. I think it's enormously empowering for African Americans, right to the present. I think for the most part, with some exceptions, the Great Migration led to higher standards of living, longer life expectancies, greater educational opportunities, more political rights, all of these things. You can look at the election that we just had 2 weeks ago, and you can see that the African-American vote in cities like Detroit and Philadelphia and other places made the difference in some cases, right? So lots of opportunity, and that's a byproduct of the Great Migration. So lots of opportunities, but also some problems. And we'll get into that as we start to get into the latter stages of our talk today. Going back to the World War I era, let's not kid ourselves. The departure of African-Americans stirred violence. The arrival of African Americans in new areas stirred violence. And at the very beginning of the Great Migration, there was an explosion of this violence known as Red Summer. We had this summer in 2020, terrible violence in some cases, protests, rallies, demonstrations, and all of that's really important. But if we go back a century, we would find horrific wholesale slaughter of African Americans. Entire African American neighborhoods burned to the ground in places like Arkansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, all over the country, really. And this explosion of violence was a direct response by the white community to the Great Migration. As African Americans moved to new cities, and often what happens is you leave your rural Southern community and you first move to maybe a Southern city, right? And you're now competing for jobs. And as whites and Blacks compete for jobs, African Americans are increasingly targeted. Some historians have called these race riots, but I think if you look closely, you'll find that this is really, in some cases, mass terrorism and mass murder. This is almost always instigated by the white community as a direct response to what they perceive as a threat to their jobs. And this Red Summer exploded. You can see this, by the way, in recent, I haven't seen this show, but Watchmen, I think, explores some of the violence of this era in its own sort of odd way. But it's something that I think has been underreported, this wave of violence as a result of the Great Migration. This is Tulsa. Tulsa, the Black neighborhood of Tulsa was essentially burned to the ground. There were mass lynchings, not just Tulsa, but all over the country. And this continued into the 1920s. This was in Southern California. You see any area where you see people, again, either leaving in big numbers or arriving in new cities like Chicago, New York, Even in strange places like Bisbee, Arizona, where there's intense competition for the mining jobs that are down there on the Mexican-US border. That causes tension, right? I can't emphasize enough the economic trouble that connects to the Great Migration, because wherever people are feeling threatened economically, where they feel like they deserve the job more than you, there's often violence associated with that. What we also see, again, problems in the Great Migration. As the Great Migration takes hold, the Klan returns, the Ku Klux Klan. And what's interesting about the Klan in the 1920s and 30s is it's now nationwide. It's now more connected to political leadership. It's now increasingly trying to impose itself in legislation to make it more difficult for African Americans to get jobs, to rent apartments. It's still involved in terrorism and lynchings, but it's a little more politically savvy and in some ways more dangerous as a result. And you could go back to the 1920s and find Klan rallies in Los Angeles, Chicago, in fact, all over the country. This was in Ohio, Dayton, 1923. 7,000 people at a Klan rally. In the 1800s, you wouldn't have seen this kind of thing in a northern city. But now, after the Great Migration, the Klan is bigger than ever. The second migration is probably less understood, but it has some interesting facets to it as well. It starts to take off, similar to the first one, with the Second World War. As we gear up, as the United States gears up to fight the Second World War, there are enormous job opportunities. And so you start to see a second wave of migrants leaving the South, looking for jobs up north, and in many cases out west, because in California, we have this incredibly important aerospace industry, which was in its infancy back then, but lots of jobs building aircraft and that sort of thing out on the West Coast. And you can see that the difference between the first migration and the second migration is really not that big of a difference, but you see the West Coast is more involved there. You also see African Americans increasingly being pulled to the north, not just for factory jobs, but also to enlist and then returning to the north after the war. What's also happening, again, problems here in the Great Migration environment, you're seeing concerted efforts in the North and in the West Coast to deny African Americans fair housing. And it's often forgotten, but one of the last things that Martin Luther King Jr. was working on prior to his death was fair housing legislation, which didn't occur in his lifetime. But what's going on, and I think in some cases still happens, is what's called redlining, where there is this subtle but very pernicious effort by city leaders, by real estate agents, by landlords to basically cordon off parts of northern cities and West Coast cities to simply deny African Americans the right to rent or to buy. So as you make your way through the Great Migration, and even if you do accumulate some wealth, there are systematic attempts to stop you from living where you want to live, okay? And this goes on across the country, I think in some ways still goes on. What's also happening is the white response to the Great Migration is profound in other ways. We start to see what's known as white flight, where huge sections of the white community in major US cities begins to leave for the suburbs. Now, they leave for a variety of reasons, but it's undeniable that one element of that departure was to move away from this growing African American community. And so as white flight takes hold, this starts to erode the tax base in some of these major cities. And so as whites leave cities like Detroit, Chicago, and elsewhere for the suburbs, the cities are left with less revenue, which leads to less services, which leads to declining cities, right? And so white flight is a direct response to the Great Migration. Whites often complain that African Americans degraded property values. There's really not a lot of evidence for that, but it didn't stop the exodus of whites into the suburbs. What you also see in the second wave of the Great Migration is real problems economically in other ways, what's sometimes called the wealth deficit. And this is a complicated thing that we could spend a lot of time on, but in the interest of time, I won't. But what happens is that while the Great Migration creates a lot of opportunities, it's still difficult for African Americans to accumulate wealth. It's difficult for African Americans to buy land, to buy property. And land is wealth, property is wealth. If you're African American in the 20th century, it's increasingly challenging to accumulate enough to pass on to the next generation, right? And if you don't have wealth to pass on to the next generation, you leave that next generation basically with little means to accumulate their own assets. And this just goes on generation after generation after generation, right? Whereas the white community, because it did not experience slavery, did not experience sharecropping to the degree that blacks did, it is often able to pass down land to its kids and to its grandkids and so on. This just isn't very possible for the black community because of the legacy of black codes, sharecropping, Jim Crow, and slavery. And so as these cities get hollowed out in the 1950s and 60s with less resources, with fewer job opportunities, you start to see crime go up, you start to see urban blight and urban decay. And throughout the 1960s, you start to see real race riots, the kind of race riots we hadn't seen in this country for decades. Almost every summer of the 1960s saw a wave of racial unrest. You start to see very common occurrences of police brutality. And of course, this happened in South Central Los Angeles, but it also happened in Newark, in Detroit, in Chicago, all over the country. And I mentioned this to you today, not only because it's a byproduct of the Great Migration, but because, and I hope this is clear, the problems that were going on for African Americans in the 20th century are absolutely with us today. Problems of fair housing, problems of police brutality, all these things that are a legacy of the 1800s are still happening in this century. This is Detroit or Newark, New Jersey riots. You're also starting to see, just as we saw in the 1920s, in the 1960s and 70s, you're starting to see, as a part of the Great Migration, a return to Black nationalism, a return to Black empowerment, a more politicized Black youth. I think we see that today as well. This is a limited map of some of the race riots that occurred across the country. You see the Bay Area had quite a few. So what happens as we wind it down here today, what happens for African Americans is, I think we could argue that the Great Migration was in many ways a positive development, in many ways an empowering development, and in many ways a necessary development. It's clear that had African Americans stayed in the South, they would have continued to be denied basic rights, right? Education, voting rights, economic justice. It's also clear that the Great Migration presented enormous challenges as African Americans made a new life for themselves in the North. You see that if you look at median income in this chart, you see that African Americans have consistently trailed other groups, both in the national average and the white community. And while there have been signs of progress, it still lags in many cases. And as we know, despite some of the gains of the Great Migration, recessions tend to hit African Americans harder than other groups. If you look at the COVID pandemic, it's interesting and terrible in many ways that COVID has hit African American communities harder than other groups. And I think that's in part a legacy of some of the things we've talked about today. You also start to see, as a result of some of the economic crisis and problems going on in the Black community, a disproportionate number of African Americans incarcerated. So again, I think the Great Migration was primarily positive, but I certainly would be remiss if I didn't mention that it's led to some problems, and that moving to the North was not perfect. It was not without incredible challenges. So with that, I want to turn it over to questions, comments, thoughts. Thanks for your attention. I think Saab will walk us through any questions we might have. So let's do that. Okay,
so audience, it's your time. Questions and answers. I did not see any questions in the chat room. I think maybe people are shy or reserved. You're welcome to ask him questions. This is an incredible story, and he's an expert on this field. And so feel free to ask questions. You can just unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask questions. We have until 12:15, so we have a few minutes.
Brent, I've got a question.
Okay.
You showed us a graph early on of the number of the population change, decrease in some of the southern cities.
Mm-hmm.
African Americans. And I'm curious about the socioeconomic status within that strata of those that left versus those that stayed.
Yeah.
Because you've got to finance that trip somehow.
That's
You've
right.
got to have food, you've got to have transportation. Not everybody just gets on a train. There's pictures of people in cars heading out west. So did the poorest of the poor get left behind, basically?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. It's one of, when we have a talk like this, we're always scratching the surface, and there's so much nuance that we don't always get to. But your question is an excellent one, and you kind of answered your own question. The data is pretty clear that those that took part in the Great Migration were typically of the Black community that migrated was typically of a higher standard of living, higher economic status than most African Americans. They were able to put together the resources to get train tickets, to get rent money when they got up north. And so you're right. What's left behind are the poorest of the Black community and the least empowered of the Black community that were not able to make that migration, right? What's also interesting is that migrants, especially in the first wave, those migrants that, say, landed in Detroit were often enjoying a higher standard of living than some of the white community in, say, Detroit. Okay, so yeah, it's a great question, and typically those that took part in the Great Migration were of a higher standard of living, and many African Americans, roughly half, were simply unable to make the journey. So it's a good question.
And to also add to that, Tim, there was also some people were just scared to leave. So some of it probably played into the fact that it was the poorest people, but there were people they didn't know life outside the South. And so that mentality of leaving to a whole brand new place out west was like, nah, I'd rather, I was born here, I'm gonna die here, so that also played into that. I know that because my grandmother and my great uncle, they were born towards the back end of the Jim Crow and that era. So they've lived through some of these experiences. And my grandma, as much as I love her, she still has that mentality of not leaving or traveling more than 5-6 miles outside of where you are. Even today, it's still part of her psyche anyway. It's kept her from traveling, to certain parts, but throughout the years, she has often suggested things, and it's like, Grandma, the world is bigger than, so I would say that probably played into a part as well.
Yeah.
To comment, Brent, I would say, thank you for putting on this talk. A lot of the, I was really inspired, and part of what I have to do for Black History Month is putting on a full slate of discussion. So I would really love to sit down and have this presentation again, and then we could flesh out some of the more inner workings, like the Harlem Renaissance, sharecropping, and the financial deficit, and how all of this plays into a factor today. Because a lot of what you were talking about, the disenfranchisement, that when Black people speak of, this is what we mean, and so I just want to say, thank you for putting on these talks. And I got this book right here that I'm gonna be going through to put together, for Black History Month. But
yeah, that's great.
You sparked a lot of this, and just thank you for, for trying to paint a picture, to paint it, paint the whole picture to see, because, people think this was a long time ago, but when you look at the numbers and the dates, it really wasn't. you know?
Well, I agree, and I thank you for your comments, Brandon, as always. Yeah, the reason this topic appeals to me is because it's underreported, but it's also absolutely relevant to 2020. All these issues that we're talking about are still going on, and you're right. I mean, some of these issues like white flight or sharecropping, I think if you were really to do them justice, you have to pull them out and talk about them on their own. They're all sort of interwoven together, but you're right. And then one other comment, you know, your grandmother's story, I love that personalizing of all this. I think there's a lot of evidence to back up her experience. I think that's not just her view. I think there's a lot of that going on where people you're right. I think they were absolutely afraid to go to the north. Those that were part of the Great Migration, they were not naive. I mean, they understood that going to the north probably meant there's no going back because it's real hard to pay for the journey and the new life. So there's probably no going back. And so that alone, I think, is really terrifying to a lot of people. It may be a difficult environment here in the South, but at least I know what it is, right?
Yeah.
At least I know the people, I know what it's going to be like. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think, and you use the word fear. I think fear sort of undergirds so much of this, right? Mm-hmm. Fear of the unknown, fear of what I do know. But yeah, I think your anecdote.
And now that I'm thinking about it, you also have to think about, I think we kind of have this idea that all of them were treated, you know, badly, which I think a big majority of them was. But when I speak to my grandma, she often says, well, the white people that we worked for were very good to us. You know, they often gave us clothes. They often made sure we had food, you know, and she was in her younger years had to go and clean the houses, you know, so they weren't necessary. My uncle, now he actually had to pick cotton. Mm-hmm. He actually remembers picking cotton to burn the mortgage on the house that they were living in at 10 years old. So and it's a funny story. He actually liked this girl. So I guess he was picking cotton and giving her his portion to like get her attention, you know, and it cracks me up when I hear that, like, wow, you know, but you know, so yeah, so you know, when I hear their stories, you know, they say, well, you know, ones that we worked for were actually really good, you know, they actually treated us very well. So that I think also plays into the equation as well. Like, well, maybe there were probably a small population. I was like, well, you know, we actually kind of got it pretty good here.
I think there's evidence for that too. That's a great point. And I also would argue that, you know, going up north is challenging too, because you have no kinship networks. You have no support networks. You either pay the rent or you don't, right? You don't work out arrangements, right? And so it's very sink or swim to move to Chicago. It still is. And I think that's daunting for people. And so I think that's discouraging some migrants. So to Tim's point, a lot of them didn't make the journey because they simply couldn't put the means together. To your point, a lot of them didn't make the journey for these other reasons entirely. Yeah. So I think those are both sort of connected together.
Yep.
Thank you both.
I saw that
actually had a question. Was up. Yeah, as the migration, especially the second migration towards the west, the percentage of the African American community that participated in that migration, how is that with relevance to other poor minority communities that had entered the U.S.? Was it out of proportion, or these poor communities, was it about the same proportion of the population that would look for these jobs?
Do you mean to ask, was the Black community moving out west a large? Are you asking if it was what percentage or what proportion it made up of other migrants to, say, the West Coast?
Yeah, for instance, like if 20% of the African American community moved out west looking for jobs, would a similar percentage of other minority groups be also moving, or was the African American community moving out of proportion to other minority groups?
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I have to dodge it a little bit because you really have to go into city after city because it really does differ. For instance, they're outnumbered in the San Francisco Bay Area by other groups that are coming in, right? So, and what happens is that they find themselves moving to places like the Bay and
froze.
and the jobs are incredibly competitive, incredibly scarce, because there's all kinds of budget in the sense that we'd have to go city by city. In a place like Los Angeles, they would make up a greater percentage probably, but it does depend. In a place like Chicago, that's not in the West, of course, but they're competing with Czech and Polish and other groups. And so they would make a smaller percentage. I don't know if that answers your question or not. It's a good one, but we have to kind of dive into the demographics.
Yeah, I was just looking at broad strokes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Feel free to ask questions.
I would just kind of add on to maybe to try to attempt at answering Raymond's question. I think in terms of when you look at the second migration, I think Black people, we were just trying to escape the South. So we were going to where whichever offered us a better life. And so I think some people ended up in Detroit, up north. Some people ended out west. I don't think it was necessarily like, hey, it was kind of like a pinpoint. It was like, which place can we get to where we think it's better than what's going on here in the South. So.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think also one of the things that we probably should emphasize more is that great migrants tended to be fairly upwardly mobile once they got there. And I think that's in part because it kind of takes a special kind of person to make that leap from Alabama to Los Angeles. It still does, I suppose, but it's a hardy group of people. It's a tough-minded group of people to take those risks. And I think risk-taking is fundamental to economic success in some ways. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of sort of nuances to all this stuff, and when we talk about this with such broad brushstrokes, we're leaving out some of the human element. And I want to, in that vein, mention a really great book that covers this whole topic called "The Warmth of Other Suns," and it I think does a great job. It's one of the best nonfiction works I've read in a while about this topic, because it looks at the demographics, the economics that we've been talking about, but interlaces that analysis with human stories and oral history that really puts sort of blood in the veins, so to speak. And The Warmth of Other Suns, I think I believe it won the National Book Award, but as soon as I say that, it probably didn't. But anyway, a really great sort of combination of the human element with the broad brushstrokes.
So I should tell you a quick story. Most people don't know this, and it's hard to believe, but I have spent about 8 years of my life in the state of South Carolina. Okay, really, okay. And I met my wife there. We've been married for 32 years, and we got married in the Greenville County. And of course, we get the license and everything. And after we got married, I was just looking at this document, which is a marriage license at the state of South Carolina. And unknown to us, there was a box, there are two boxes, white and black, because they had to identify somebody. They didn't even ask us, they just checked it by themselves. But there are only two race boxes, black and white. And we were considered white. They just checked white for both of us. My wife is Korean American. I'm Japanese American. And for as far as they're concerned, in the state of South Carolina 32 years ago, there were only two races. And since we were not black, we were considered white. And some of my friends still call me white boy just because that's what it says. And the United States acknowledges I am a white person. Anyway, yeah. It's only 30 some years ago. And it's amazing that, these views still are so implicit in these documents.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because you have, in the South today, you have a real influx of Latinos coming in to seek jobs, and they are often defined as white or not white or whatever, depending on these really odd racial categories that you're talking about. So you're right, it still goes on.
Well, it's because, they want this, it's the census, right? It's the number of population. So when you talk about, redlining, if you count more people as white, and they live in certain districts, certain neighborhoods, they can say this district is a predominantly white district, and they could draw it up, for the voting purpose, wherever they want it. So that's kind of like, I think, where a lot of that undermines it, and Saab, God bless you for living in South Carolina for 8 years. And, it's funny. I saw you at the talk when we were talking about how COVID-19 has affected the Chinese community and the non-Asian community. And you said how you didn't understand a lot of, you said you thought you knew English, but when you went down south, you thought you couldn't understand it. Trust me, I'm born in this country and I still don't understand a lot of the stuff that they say in the South, sometimes. But like I said, in all seriousness, you kind of brought it up in the discussion, Brent, how you talk about, when you look at, the quote, the Negro was free for a brief minute in the sun, and then he headed back towards slavery. It's not that he headed back towards slavery. Society transformed what slavery looked like. So when you look at our history, it still happens today, right? So you had the Emancipation Proclamation, you had that brief, like you said, that brief time of like Reconstruction, where it was like, oh, but then Jim Crow comes into it.
It's 10 years.
Yeah, Jim Crow comes into play, right? And you see the literacy test, you see all these other things, and the cheap labor was a factor, right? The sharecropping. Well, and we say this now, and I suggest everybody should, read Michelle Alexandria's book, The New Jim Crow, because the new Jim Crow is mass incarceration. When you look at the investments in private prisons and the population, like the product for private investment prisons are Black and brown people, right? So then they're in the prison, and then the cheap labor has outsourced to them, right? I talk about, look at the fires that happened over the summer. A big majority of those firefighters were people that were in prison that are just in the fire program, So when you look at the Great Migration, and you look at some of these points, a lot of them, people say, well, how can it still happen on today? Well, it's still going on. It's just not as overt as it used to be. They just found similar ways to make it a little bit covert. And so that's
the firefighting thing is so fascinating, because you're right. It's a great example. It's a terrible example, but you can serve your time, right? But now you've earned experience fighting fires, but now you're ineligible to fight fires once you're no longer in prison, right?
Yeah.
That's a great example, and I'm glad you said that, because I think that's a perfect point in terms of how all this stuff connects to the world we're in right now. Yeah.
Okay, we need to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Brent, and thank you so much to everybody who has joined us. Before you leave, though, I want you to see the polls. I think Maritza can put the polls up, and we just want to, have some honest and good feedback. And so, if you could fill this out for us, and then click on that. What is the end or send or something? I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Brent, for a wonderful lecture. And I hope to see you again this afternoon at 2:00 when Tim is going to be speaking. And tonight at 5 when Dr. Romelli will be speaking on education.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see all of you.
Thanks, Brent.
You guys see the poll?
Yes.
We couldn't do the polls, huh?
Couldn't do it either.
If we're co-hosts. Co-hosts can't do it.
Oh, okay.
So maybe we shouldn't do. Maybe we wouldn't have so many co-hosts. But what is the third question? The poll.
If
The
If
results.
this speaker presented again next year, would you attend?
Yeah. Can we scroll it down?
Do you want to say yes or no,
Yeah.
Jay?
Of
We had
course I say
100%
yes. I attend
yes.
everything Brent says. At Brent.
Do we want to stop recording?
Yeah. Let's start recording.